Okay, this is the review video for the foreign exchange market. The foreign exchange market is a market where currency is being traded and exchanged. You have to think about it in terms of if one country's citizens are buying goods and services from another country, that they're going to have to pay for those goods and services in that country's currency. So they'll have to supply their own currency and they'll demand the other currency from the country in which they're buying goods. And so that exchange of goods and services facilitates this foreign exchange market. So there's a couple of things that you need to consider as well. You need to note that if someone is investing in foreign banks, that they're going to have to invest in that country's currencies as well. So when we talked about interest rates in the loanable funds market, when interest rates are more profitable in another country's banks or investment types, then they're going to invest in that country and they're going to also need that country's currencies. So the best way I want to go over the foreign exchange market is the best way to visualize this is to look at the graphs side by side. So essentially what's going to happen is that you have two currencies that you are comparing. In the foreign exchange market, you're only comparing two countries' currencies at one time. So everything is relative to the other country. So even though, let's say, for example, that the US dollar appreciates, it only appreciates relative to the country that you are comparing that currency to. So when you have the foreign exchange market, let's say, for example, that you are comparing the US dollar, and I'm going to go with the videos that I put on Edpuzzle, the Canadian dollars example. And so one of the most important things to know about the foreign exchange market is how to label the graph. And so on the y-axis, remember that the y-axis is always some sort of price. And so whenever you're looking in terms of one currency, the value of one currency in terms of another currency is called the exchange rate. So the exchange rate is what goes on the y-axis. In this case, then, there's also a couple of rules that I want for you guys to make note of. So if on your notes, wherever you're writing your notes, you should also have a section that says rules of the foreign exchange. The first one is called the bottom to bottom rule. So on the y-axis, there's going to be some sort of equation, right? Some sort of ratio, because you need to say that for every $1 US that you supply to the market, then it's going to be worth some number of Canadian dollars. So let's say that this is the graph for the US dollar, whichever currency that this is the graph for, that goes on the bottom of this equation as well as the bottom of this graph. This x-axis is going to be the quantity of the US dollar. So you label the bottom axes and the bottom of this ratio to be the currency for this one, the graph for this one currency. The same goes for the Canadian dollar. In this case, then, the US dollar, for every $1 US in terms of Canadian dollars. So that's the exchange rate. How many US dollars will you receive in exchange for one Canadian dollar? Again, it explains on the video the 1-to-1 ratio. And then on this bottom or x-axis, the quantity of the Canadian dollars, okay? So this first rule, the bottom to bottom rule, essentially just helps you to remember where to label each of the axes in terms of the currency that you are illustrating. So then you have, like he says on the video, regular just supply and demand. Upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. Again, if you don't remember that, remember Scooby-Doo or San Diego or Salty Dogs. And at the point of equilibrium, then, is your exchange rate. He labels it 1-to-1. I have seen it and always have labeled it and learned it ER. That's just the exchange rate. And at its point of equilibrium as well, the quantity of the currency. Okay, so that's how you label a foreign exchange market. The things that we... Again, the reasons that we compare foreign exchange is because of the international transactions. If we are buying a country's goods and services, then we're going to have to pay for that country's goods and services in their currency. And so, for example, he does talk about on the video on Edpuzzle to think about who supplies and who demands each one of these currencies. And when you think about that, or if you have that in your mind, then it's easier to evaluate the problems for foreign exchange. is a few things that some students have a problem with foreign exchange, in the sense that there's not always only one right answer. However, on the test, if you do come across a question about foreign exchange, it's going to be very specific in terms of like what happens to the supply of the US dollar in this scenario, or what happens to the demand of the Canadian dollar in this scenario. It will be very specific. So in any case then, let me fast forward to the shifters of the foreign exchange market, and I don't know if I'm gonna go over these in the same order as the video, but the shifters of foreign exchange, I always remember TP. So you can think of like toilet paper or TP, like a, TP. The first is your taste, and this is also taste or preference. Let's say, for example, that all of a sudden there are goods from China that, like when Hello Kitty, or was that Japan? Who knows? But when Hello Kitty was so popular that we were demanding that good from that country, and so then we were essentially demanding more of their currency. So when taste and preference increases, then we demand more of their currency. When it decreases, we demand less of that country's currency. This also goes for tourism. So right now at the moment, there's nobody really traveling to China, especially because of the coronavirus. And so the demand for the Chinese currency would decrease. The first I on here is also income, and income has to do also, remember, with the demand, like just regular demand. We said that when people have more money, they're going to spend more money. When people have less money, they're going to spend less money. So income is going to affect the demand of currency, in the sense that if they have more money, they're going to buy more foreign goods. If they have less money, they're going to buy less foreign goods. Price level is the next one, and this is also inflation. Inflation is when the overall price level of an economy is increasing. And so you're not going to want to buy goods and services in a place or in a country where the price of those goods are going up, right? We're going to want to buy goods and services from a country in which the price level is lower, and we can buy more. So price level is also going to affect the amount of goods and services that we essentially demand from that country. And then the last one is interest rates. So interest rates, the last I is interest rates. Interest rates comes with the idea of like capital inflow and outflow. Remember the loanable funds market. When interest rates are better in one country than they are in your own country, then there are people that will invest in foreign banks. And when they do, they're going to have to invest in that country's currency. So let's say, for example, that I want to put my money in a Brazilian bank, then I'm going to need to buy their currency to invest in their banks. So these are the shifters of the foreign exchange. Okay, you can again remember TP as their as the shifters that affect foreign exchange, but that's basically it. Okay, the first thing that I want to do is just kind of go over like an example. So let's say, for example, we're going to do taste and preference, that all of a sudden people are touring Canada. We want to go and visit Canada, so we are going to need Canadian dollars, right? In this sense, then, before we start anything, I want for you to think about who supplies US dollars. So if we were giving our dollars in exchange for Canadian dollars, Americans are the ones that in this case supply the US dollar. And who would demand the US dollar in this case would be Canadians. When it comes to the Canadian dollar, the supply of Canadian dollars comes from Canadians, because they are the ones giving their Canadian dollars in exchange for, in this case, US dollars. And the demand of the Canadian dollar, would be Americans. So let's say, for example, that there's a question that states, what would happen if, to the demand of Canadian dollars, if Americans were touring Canada, or that they were that they were going to visit Canada more often. So if Americans are going to visit Canada, they're going to need Canadian dollars, and essentially the demand for Canadian dollars would increase. So we would draw a shift to the right of the demand curve. The new equilibrium then is going to cause for this exchange rate to go up. When an exchange rate goes up, this is called appreciation. Appreciation, or for the currency to appreciate, means that the value of their dollar or the exchange rate has increased. One of the other rules that you'll need to know for this, and this is also in order for Americans to demand Canadian dollars, they're going to need to supply more of their American dollars in exchange for that Canadian dollar. So sometimes this is where students kind of get a little bit confused, and I don't want for you to completely shut down if you don't necessarily understand this concept. If you understand what happens to demand or supply on either one graph, then you can kind of, with rule number 2, figure out what's happening to the other currency. So one of the rules is that if demand and supply are going to shift together. So if demand goes up on this graph, then that means that supply is going to go up on this graph. Regardless of whether or not that you understand what is exactly happening to supply, and I'll explain it in just a minute, then just remember that supply and demand, if demand goes up on one graph, supply is going to go up on one graph, on the other. If supply goes down on one graph, then demand is going to go down on the other graph. And so right now we'll go back to the rules in just a minute. In this case, once supply has increased, because remember, Americans are giving more of their dollars so that they can receive, or because they're demanding more Canadian dollars. They're exchanging, they're giving their dollars in exchange for Canadian dollars. And so when they demand more Canadian dollars, it appreciates. When Americans supply more US dollars, then the exchange rate goes down, and this is called depreciate. So for a currency to depreciate, that means that the value of this country's currency has gone down relative to, and only in comparison to, this other country. Relative to Canada, the US dollar has depreciated, has gone down in value, and the Canadian dollar has appreciated, has gone up in value relative to the US dollar. So 2 more rules to add to our list of rules. The first was the bottom to bottom rule. The second is that supply and demand are going to shift together. So together. So if, let's say, on one currency's supply goes up, then on the other currency's graph, demand will go up. If supply goes down, then on the other country's currency, demand will go down, and vice versa. Okay? And vice versa. Okay, the third rule that I want for you to also add is that one currency will always appreciate. Yes, that is my dog barking, I apologize. And one will always depreciate. So let's say that you work out your shifts, and both currencies are appreciating, or both currencies are depreciating, then you know that you've done something wrong. One currency will always appreciate, one will always depreciate, because remember that you're comparing 2 currencies. So you can't have both of them increase in value. When you're comparing them, one has to go up, and the other will then eventually, or will then go down as a result. So foreign exchange rules: 1, bottom to bottom. Supply and demand will always go up and down together, and one currency will always appreciate and one will always depreciate. On the video, he talks about how appreciation and depreciation is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, and we'll talk about that in the last rule that I'm going to add on here. Okay, so in any case then, going back to the graphs, one again will always appreciate, the other will always depreciate, and this is why I like to show both currencies side by side like this. Most of the time on the economics exam, on the AP macro exam, they ask you to just draw out like the currencies, the foreign exchange market for one currency. It's so much easier. I've always taught my students to do it side by side like this so that you can show, like the shifts, and also you can visualize the appreciated or depreciated dollar. Okay. In this sense, then, let's go over the last rule. Okay, so remember I said that appreciated and depreciated dollars are not necessarily a good or a bad thing. So put that in your mind. It's not always necessarily good or bad. However, if you also should remember, there's always going to be a follow-up question about how this ties into the balance of payments. And we have not gone over the balance of payments in this semester. but we did go over the balance of payments in the first semester. So if you remember what I'm talking about, this was the imports and exports, the financial account, and the current account. And so I asked you guys to think of these as the twin brothers of the evil twins of foreign exchange. So if you remember SID and you remember the acronym WES, then you will be able to answer these questions regardless if you completely understand the balance of payments. So let's say, for example, that you have a stronger dollar. Let's say that your dollar has appreciated. This is an appreciated dollar. Okay, so if you have a stronger dollar, imports are going to go up. Imports are goods and services that we buy from other countries. If our country's currency is higher in value or relative to that other country's currency, then that means that their goods are cheaper for us. So we're going to buy more goods from that country, and so our imports are going to go up. Okay? When our imports go up, then we end up with a trade deficit. A trade deficit means that we are importing more than we are exporting. I believe that that is a greater than symbol. So this is a trade deficit tends to be, you can consider it to be a little bit of a negative, which is why an appreciated dollar is not necessarily a good thing. So in terms of this, to explain this a little bit, in terms that you might understand, for example, Mexico's peso is very depreciated compared to the US dollar. So for us, our goods and services that we buy from Mexico are a lot cheaper than they are here in the United States. And so then we buy more goods from Mexico or from other countries where their currency is not as valuable as ours. Okay. When you have a depreciated dollar, okay, then when you have a weaker dollar, that means that your dollar is, the exchange rate of the value of your dollar has gone down. That means that your exports are going to go up. Let's say that our dollar is weak, like for example, Mexico's peso is weaker than the United States dollar. We buy more goods from there. So if our dollar is weaker, then other countries are going to buy goods and services from us because for them it will be cheaper and our exports will go up. We're going to be selling more goods and services than we're buying, and this is going to cause a trade surplus. A trade surplus is when we're exporting more than we are importing. And again, exporting, this is the symbol for exports. This is the symbol for imports. And so a depreciated dollar, you cannot necessarily consider a bad thing, because if it turns out that we end up with a trade surplus, then that's actually a good thing. So do not put in your mind that there is a good or bad, that it's good or bad that we have a depreciated or appreciated dollar. And also keep in mind these acronyms side by side, because you might need them for the test. So the test might give you an example, like for example, if there was, if the demand, let's say for example, they say that we're touring Canada more. So what happens to the demand for Canadian dollars? So you show the increase, you know that it has appreciated. Then it's going to ask you, now that the Canadian dollar is appreciated relative to the US dollar, will they be in a trade surplus, in a trade deficit, or in a trade like a balance? And so you basically can go to here and say, well, if their Canadian dollar appreciated, then that means that they're going to end up in a trade deficit. And you can, if they ask you to explain, you can explain that the imports have gone up. The best thing for you to do is just practice with these. I'm going to put a few examples that you can go over along with another YouTube video where he goes over the answers of these, and you can practice this for just for the foreign exchange. I'm also going to post probably soon the balance of payments, just to go over that. And then also lastly, the aggregate supply and demand curve. So stay tuned and study for your exam.